nestled in the suffocating embrace of jagged peaks. Blue Ridge is a town where shadows cast long and sinister fingers, where the air itself seems to whisper secrets too ancient and terrible to name. I am Ryan Mitchell, a man haunted by my own demons, drawn to this remote mountain town by the death of my uncle Thomas Mitchell. A death cloaked in ambiguity and dread. What I thought would be a journey of closure became a descent into a nightmare that clawed at the edges of reality, revealing a horror that has lurked beneath the mountain for generations. In the style of John Langan, whose prose weaves dread into the very fabric of the mundane, this documentary story expands the raw transcript of my experience into a chilling tapestry of fear, betrayal, and the unyielding hunger of an ancient entity. Recorded in the eerie stillness of Raven's Peak Lodge, this narrative is not just a recounting. It is a plunge into the abyss, enriched with the weight of history, the sting of isolation, and the desperate search for truth. Prepare to walk the marked paths of Blue Ridge, but know this: the forest watches, the beast waits, and the darkness may already know your name. Arrival in the shadowed valley, a town under siege by silence. The bus screeched to a halt on the edge of Blue Ridge, its engines growl a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that greeted me as I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk of Main Street. My bag, heavy with the weight of my past, hung over my shoulder, while Uncle Thomas's keys, sharp and cold, dug into my palm, a physical reminder of the man I'd come to mourn. The town lay nestled between mountains that seemed to crowd too close, their peaks jagged and unyielding, as if they were ancient guards intent on suffocating the life from the valley below. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and something sharper, something metallic that I couldn't place. The sky above was a bruised gray, heavy with clouds that promised a storm, but it was the stillness that unnerved me most. No birds sang, no wind rustled the leaves, just a silence that felt alive, watchful. Only one other passenger disembarked with me. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of years and secrets, her eyes darting nervously as she clutched a tattered shawl around her shoulders. She hurried away without a word, her steps quick and purposeful, disappearing around a corner as if fleeing some unseen pursuer. I stood alone, the bus's taillights fading into the distance, leaving me with the skeletal remains of what passed for civilization in Blue Ridge. Main Street stretched before me, its storefronts weathered and faded, their windows dark and reflective, like the eyes of a predator lying in wait. A few figures moved along the sidewalks, their heads bowed, their movements hurried, but none looked at me directly. Their glances were furtive, quick darts of suspicion that flickered away as soon as I met their gaze, as if I were a specter they dared not acknowledge. 3 buildings down, the sheriff's office loomed, a squat, uninviting structure of peeling paint and shadowed windows, its sign hanging crookedly above the door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old coffee and dust. A desk sergeant sat hunched over a crossword puzzle, his pencil scratching at the paper with a rhythm that seemed to echo the town's heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken tension. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing into slits as I spoke my name. "Mitchell," he said, his voice low and gravelly, not a question but a statement, laced with something I couldn't quite identify, disdain, perhaps, or fear. "Thomas's nephew." I nodded, my throat tight, and he rose without a word, disappearing into a back room. He returned moments later with a cardboard box, its edges worn and stained, and slid it across the counter with a grunt that spoke of reluctance. "Everything we collected from the scene," he muttered, his voice flat, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest. "What exactly happened?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. The phone call I'd received 3 weeks prior had been maddeningly vague, just that Thomas had died in what they called an accident on the mountain, a fall during his night shift that had left him with a fatal head wound. But the brevity of the call, the lack of detail, had gnawed at me, a splinter of doubt that refused to be ignored. The sergeant's face tightened, his jaw clenching as if my question had struck a nerve. "It's all in the report," he said, tapping a folder on top of the box with a finger that trembled slightly. Fell during his night shift. Bad head wound. Probably died right away. The words were rote, rehearsed, but his refusal to meet my gaze told a different story. A story of secrets buried deep, of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. I signed the release form, my signature shaky, and gathered the box into my arms. It was disturbingly light, a hollow vessel for a man's life. A leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. A wallet containing $43, the bills crisp and untouched. A ring of keys marked Lodge, their metal cold against my skin, and Thomas's watch, its face frozen at 2:17, as if time itself had stopped with his death. "Town's not used to outsiders," the sergeant said as I turned to leave, his voice low, a warning wrapped in the guise of advice. "Even family." I nodded, the weight of his words settling into my bones, and stepped back into the cooling afternoon. The streets were alive with a muted hum of activity, but the people of Blue Ridge moved with a purpose that felt almost mechanical, their eyes skittering away from me as I passed. They glanced, then looked away, quick and furtive, their fear palpable in the way they hunched their shoulders, as if expecting a blow from an unseen hand. The air carried a weight, a palpable unease that clung to my skin like damp fog, and as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains themselves were watching, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the town. The town's unwelcoming embrace. A community bound by fear. Before heading to the cabin, I needed supplies, food to sustain me, a tether to normalcy in a place that felt anything but normal. The general store sat at the end of the block. Its sign faded to illegibility, its windows streaked with grime that seemed to mirror the town's collective reluctance to reveal its truths. A bell jingled overhead as I pushed open the door, its chime sharp and jarring in the thick silence that enveloped the interior. The store was dimly lit, its shelves stocked with a haphazard assortment of goods. Canned soups, stale bread, jars of preserves that looked like they'd been sitting there for decades. Four figures stood near the counter, their conversation halting abruptly as they turned to stare at me. Their eyes were hard, glittering with suspicion, and the air thickened with unspoken judgment, a tangible force that pressed against my chest. "Help you?" The man behind the register grunted, his voice rough as gravel. He was broad-shouldered, with thick hands that looked more suited to wielding an axe than ringing up groceries, and a gray beard that framed a face hardened by years of toil and secrets. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and forced a nod. "Just picking up some basics," I said, moving toward the grocery aisle, my footsteps loud in the oppressive quiet. The whispers started before I'd taken 5 steps, their voices low and urgent, a chorus of suspicion that followed me like a shadow. Mitchell's nephew, just like him, here to stick his nose where it don't belong. Better hope he's smarter than his uncle was. The words were a knife to the gut, a confirmation of the hostility I'd sensed since stepping off the bus. Thomas had been an outsider here, just as I was now, and whatever he'd uncovered had cost him his life. I could feel it in the way they spoke his name, a mix of fear and disdain that hung heavy in the air. I grabbed what I needed with trembling hands, bread, its crust hard and unyielding. Eggs, their shells speckled with dirt. Coffee, the ground smelling faintly of mildew. And a couple of cans of soup, their labels peeling at the edges. Each item felt like a small victory, a piece of normalcy in a place that seemed to reject it at every turn. At the counter, the man, Sam Guthrie, as I'd learned, rang me up in silence, his movements precise, mechanical, as if he were performing a ritual he'd done 1,000 times before. The others had dispersed to different corners of the store, suddenly engrossed in products they'd been ignoring moments before, but I could feel their eyes on me, their stares burning into my back like a brand. "I'm Ryan Mitchell," I said, sliding cash across the worn wood, the bills damp with sweat from my palm. Thomas was my uncle. Sam counted my change with deliberate care, his thick fingers moving slowly, as if he were stalling for time. The others remained silent, their feigned interest in dusty shelves a thin veil for their scrutiny. "Sam Guthrie," he finally said, his voice low, bagging my goods with a roughness that belied his careful counting. "Sorry about your uncle." The words were hollow, a formality rather than a sentiment, and they hung between us. Incomplete. A door left ajar but not opened. I waited, hoping for more, but he offered nothing, his silence a wall I couldn't breach. "Any chance you knew him well?" I tried again, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the bag. "Not really. Came in for supplies now and then," kept to himself. He pushed the bag forward, a clear dismissal, his tone final. "Cabin's up on Mill Creek Road. Last one before the forest starts proper." I took the hint, gathering my bag and stepping back into the street, the weight of their stares following me like a shroud. The afternoon had grown colder, the sky darkening with the promise of rain, and as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was rejecting me. Its people bound by a collective fear that I was only beginning to understand. The mountains loomed larger now, their shadows stretching across the street, and I felt their presence like a physical weight, a reminder that Blue Ridge was a place where secrets were guarded as fiercely as life itself. The cabin's silent confession, echoes of a troubled soul. The cabin emerged at the end of a dirt driveway, a weathered structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, its walls crying out for a fresh coat of paint. Pine trees flanked it on three sides, their branches scraping the roof with every gust of wind, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness of the place. The forest pressed close, its shadows deep and uninviting, and as I stepped onto the creaking porch, I felt a chill that had little to do with the cooling air. Inside, the cabin smelled of must and neglect, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and forgotten memories. A single main room served as both kitchen and living area, its sparse furnishings, a sagging couch, a small TV with rabbit ears, a kitchen table cluttered with junk mail. Speaking of a life lived in solitude, a bedroom and bathroom branched off to the side, their doors slightly ajar, as if inviting me to uncover their secrets. I set my bags down on the table, the silence pressing against my ears like a physical force. Thomas hadn't been one for decoration. The walls were bare, save for a faded photograph of him standing beside a river, his smile strained, his eyes distant. The kitchen cabinets held only the essentials. Mismatched plates, chipped cups, a few cans of beans and corn, their labels faded with age. But it was what I found behind these mundane items that told the real story of my uncle's final days. Behind the bread box, an empty whiskey bottle gleamed in the dim light, its label peeling at the edges. Another lurked under the bathroom sink, nestled between a rusted can of shaving cream and a roll of toilet paper. In the bedroom closet, hidden behind a pile of moth-eaten sweaters, I found three more, their glass cloudy with fingerprints, their contents long since drained. I knew the drill all too well. 6 months sober, I'd hidden bottles from roommates, from girlfriends, from myself, stashing them in places where I could pretend they didn't exist until the urge became too strong to resist. The sight of Thomas's bottles tightened my throat, a bitter echo of my own struggles, a reminder of the darkness we'd both fought against. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging beneath me, and ran my fingers over the glass of one of the bottles, its surface cold and unyielding. The urge to drink was there, a whisper in the back of my mind, but I pushed it down, focusing instead on the task at hand. Thomas had been running from something more than just his demons. I could feel it in the air, in the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. Beneath the pile of junk mail on the kitchen table, an envelope caught my eye, its crisp white paper a stark contrast to the clutter around it. The letterhead read, Ravens Peak Mountain Lodge, and my name was scrawled across the front in a neat, precise hand. Inside, a formal letter awaited. In the event of Thomas Mitchell's death or inability to perform his duties, the position of night watchman is offered to his next of kin, Ryan Mitchell. The letter outlined the pay, decent enough to keep me afloat for a few months, and the basic duties. Patrol the lodge from midnight to 8 a.m., log any disturbances, maintain security protocols. At the bottom, a handwritten note in a different hand added, the job is yours if you want it. Call the number. George Campbell, manager. The words sent a chill down my spine, not for their content but for their implication. They'd known I would come, expected it even, as if my arrival were a piece of a larger puzzle I couldn't yet see. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in as night fell, the shadows deepening in the corners of the room. Outside, the wind picked up, the pine branches scraping against the roof with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest itself was alive with eyes I couldn't see. The first night's unease, shadows that move. I unpacked my meager belongings, arranging them on the kitchen table as if order could ward off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. I cooked a simple dinner, canned soup heated on the ancient stove, its metallic tang a poor substitute for comfort. But the act felt hollow, a ritual performed for the sake of normalcy rather than need. The journal from the sheriff's box sat on the table, its leather cover a silent challenge, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. Thomas's words, his thoughts, his fears, they felt too raw, too real, a mirror to my own uncertainties that I wasn't prepared to confront. Sleep came hard in the unfamiliar bed, the mattress lumpy beneath me, the sheets smelling faintly of mildew. I dozed off sometime after midnight, my mind a tangle of half-formed dreams. Thomas's face pale and lifeless, the mountains, their peaks looming like teeth, the sound of footsteps in the dark. I jolted awake to a sound that cut through the silence. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause, then 3 more. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest, the rhythm too deliberate, too intentional to be the work of branches or wind. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Rising, I approached the bedroom window, dread pooling in my gut like a lead weight. The glass reflected my pale, hollow-eyed face against the darkness outside, and I pressed closer, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the glare. Beyond the window, the forest stretched out in an endless sea of shadows, the pine trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the darkness between them seemed to shift, deepening in a way that defied the moonlight, moving with an unnatural intent that made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, my breath fogging the glass, and drew the curtains closed with a trembling hand, the fabric rough against my fingers. Sleep didn't come again that night, the scratching echoing in my mind, a pattern that spoke of something more than mere nature. A presence, a purpose, a warning. I sat at the kitchen table, Thomas's lodge key cold in my hand, turning it over and over as if it could unlock the answers I sought. The job offer felt too convenient, too ready, a trap laid out for me to step into. But money was tight, my savings dwindling with each passing day, and the thought of returning to my old life, back to the bars, the bottles, the endless cycle of self-destruction, was a weight I couldn't bear. Not yet. Not until I knew what had really happened to Thomas, what had driven him to his death on that mountain. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pale gray, I made my decision. I'd call the number, take the job, and use it as a foothold to uncover the truth. It was a fresh start, or so I told myself, a chance to rebuild after 6 months of clawing my way towards sobriety. But even as I dialed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this start came with a price, one I wasn't yet prepared to pay. The lodge's dark heart, a fortress of secrets. Raven's Peak Lodge sat halfway up the mountain, a sprawling wooden edifice that seemed to grow out of the forest itself, its dark timbers blending seamlessly with the surrounding pines. The main building rose 3 stories, its wings stretching outward like the arms of a predator, stone chimneys piercing the roof like spines. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for 2 cars, one a rusted pickup, the other a sleek sedan that seemed out of place in this rugged landscape. I parked my own car, its engine ticking as it cooled, and approached the front doors, my footsteps loud on the gravel path. The air here was colder, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something primal, like wet earth and decay. The front doors opened into a lobby that was both grand and foreboding, its high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams, its walls adorned with trophy heads, deer, elk, a bear whose glass eyes seemed to follow me as I crossed the room. A massive stone fireplace dominated the space, its hearth cold and dark, the ashes within it undisturbed, as if no fire had burned there in years. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax, the kind of smell that spoke of neglect and secrets, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I approached the reception desk. George Campbell stood behind it, tall and gaunt, his face etched with deep lines that made him look like he was perpetually on the verge of a scowl. His eyes were a pale blue, sharp and unyielding, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Mitchell," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, no handshake offered, no warmth in his tone. "Follow me." He led me through the lobby to a small office behind the desk, its walls lined with a bank of security monitors that flickered with grainy images of empty hallways and the dark parking lot. A desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers and a thick binder, its cover stained with coffee rings. "This is your base," George said, his tone clipped, efficient. "Make rounds every hour on the hour. Check all doors and windows. Make sure everything's locked. Log anything you see in here." He tapped the binder with a bony finger, the sound sharp in the small space. "What am I looking for exactly?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at me. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Nothing," he snapped. "You're not looking for anything. You're making sure the lodge is secure." The words were a dismissal, a refusal to engage, but they only deepened my suspicion. He handed me a ring of keys and a flashlight, their weight cold and heavy in my hands, and led me through the building, his steps brisk, his posture rigid. The main floor housed the lobby, a restaurant with tables shrouded in dust covers, a bar with bottles lined up like soldiers, and a few meeting rooms, their doors locked tight. The second and third floors held guest rooms, all empty, their beds stripped bare, the air thick with the scent of disuse. "Off-season," George explained when I asked, his tone curt. "We'll have guests starting next month." The basement was last, its concrete floors echoing with our steps, the air growing colder with each descent. Storage rooms lined the corridor, their doors rusted at the hinges, filled with crates and old furniture draped in sheets. A laundry facility sat at the far end, its machines silent, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. At the end of a long hallway stood a heavy metal door, its surface scratched and dented, secured with 3 separate locks that gleamed in the dim light of the bare bulbs overhead. "This stays locked," George said, his voice low, final. "Always. No exceptions." I stared at the door, its presence a silent challenge, a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. "What's back there?" I pressed, my curiosity outweighing my caution. "Storage," he replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "Just make your rounds every hour and log anything unusual." "What qualifies as unusual?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cold corridor. His expression hardened, his pale eyes boring into mine. "Nothing is unusual here," he said, his voice flat, unyielding. "No matter what you see or hear, it's just the mountain settling or animals in the woods. Don't investigate. Don't leave the marked paths." He pointed to a map on the wall, its red lines delineating safe routes between buildings and around the property, a network of boundaries that felt more like a cage than a guide. We returned to the security office where George checked his watch, his movements precise, mechanical. "It's 8:15, he said. "Your shift runs until 8 tomorrow morning. Questions?" His face deterred inquiry, his posture a wall I couldn't breach. "No," I said, my voice hollow. "Good," he replied. "Phone's there if you need me. I live 10 minutes away. Your uncle was a good man, reliable until he wasn't." He turned to leave, then paused, his hand on the door. "Don't be late." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the flickering light of the monitors, the lodge creaking around me like a living thing. The night's first whispers. The forest holds its breath. The lodge settled into a rhythm of creaks and groans as the night deepened, its wooden bones shifting in the cooling air, each sound a reminder of its age and isolation. At 9 o'clock, I began my first round, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, its beam weak against the shadows that clung to every corner. The main floor was quiet, the doors and windows locked tight, the restaurant and bar silent as tombs. Upstairs, the guest rooms were empty, their silence oppressive, the air thick with the scent of dust and neglect. I moved quickly, my footsteps loud in the stillness, my nerves on edge as I checked each lock, each window, ensuring the lodge was secure. Back in the basement, the metal door drew my attention like a magnet, its scratched surface gleaming in the dim light. I checked it twice during my rounds, my fingers brushing the cold steel, the 3 locks holding firm under my scrutiny. Whatever was behind it, storage or something else entirely, would remain hidden, at least for now. By midnight, the outside world had fallen into an eerie silence, a void that seemed to swallow sound itself. There were no crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves, despite the branches swaying in the breeze outside the windows. The quiet felt deliberate, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At 1 a.m., a low, rumbling growl permeated the air, its source impossible to pinpoint, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that vibrated in my chest and set my teeth on edge. I checked the security monitors, my hands trembling as I scanned each screen, but nothing moved, the hallways and parking lot as empty as ever. My 2 a.m. round took me outside, following the marked path around the lodge's perimeter, my flashlight sweeping across the gravel and the tree line beyond. The silence was even worse here, a dead air that pressed against my ears, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the ground. There were no night birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the bushes, just an absence that felt alive, watchful, as if the forest itself were observing my every move. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, the beam catching the gnarled trunks of the pines, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. The darkness between them seemed deeper than it should have been, more solid, as if it were a physical thing, a barrier I couldn't penetrate. Back inside, I logged what I'd observed, or rather, what I hadn't. 2:15 a.m., complete absence of wildlife sounds. Unusual silence. The words felt inadequate, a pale reflection of the unease that coiled in my gut. At 3:17 a.m., the night erupted. A high-pitched scream cut through the silence, its pitch rising until it broke, then stopped abruptly. It was human, too human, a sound of desperation and terror that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I grabbed the phone and dialed George's number, my fingers clumsy on the buttons. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert, not the groggy tone of someone roused from sleep. "What?" he snapped, his tone sharp. "I heard a scream in the woods," I said, my voice trembling. "Sounded like someone in trouble." "Ignore it," he barked, his words a slap. "That's just how things are here. No one's hurt. No one's out there. Stay inside. Stay on the paths. Do your job." He hung up before I could argue, his lack of surprise chilling me to the core. He'd heard it before, expected it even, and his casual dismissal only deepened my fear. At 4 a.m., during my rounds, I heard footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps that crossed from one end of the lodge to the other, their rhythm steady, purposeful. I checked the security monitors, my heart pounding, but the roof camera showed nothing but empty shingles and a night sky devoid of stars. By 5 a.m., exhaustion weighed me down, my body aching from the tension of the night, my mind frayed from lack of sleep. I made coffee in the small break room, the bitter brew a poor comfort, and returned to the monitors. That's when I saw them, shadows moving at the tree line, too large to be human, too purposeful to be tricks of the light. They moved between the trees, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes rising to stand on 2, their forms vague and shifting under the infrared lens. I tried to focus, to capture them clearly, but they vanished when I looked directly, leaving only the impression of movement, of intent. I wrote down everything. Every sound, every shadow, every moment of that unnatural quiet. My handwriting shaky, the pen digging into the paper as if I could force the truth onto the page. Dawn's false reprieve. A town that denies its fear. Dawn crept in slowly, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to a pale, sickly gray, the light weak and diffused through the heavy clouds. As the first rays touched the trees, I heard a sound like a deep, collective sigh from the forest, a release of tension that felt almost human. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the normal morning sounds filled the air. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the forest had been holding its breath all night, waiting for the light to banish whatever had stalked its shadows. George arrived at 7:55, his appearance unchanged from the night before. No messy hair, no sleepy eyes, just the same gaunt face and hard eyes, as if he hadn't slept at all. He scanned my logbook, his face tightening as he read my entries, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You wrote too much," he said, closing the book with a snap. "Just note the times of your rounds and any maintenance issues. Nothing else." His tone was flat, unyielding, a command rather than a suggestion. "I heard a scream," I countered, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on me. "Saw things moving in the woods." "No, you didn't," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You heard the wind, saw shadows from clouds passing over the moon. That's all." "There weren't any clouds last night," I said, my frustration bubbling over. His stare hardened, his pale eyes boring into mine. "This job isn't for everyone," he said, his voice low, a warning. "Your uncle understood that eventually. You need to decide if you can handle it." "What happened to him?" "Really?" I pressed, the question burning in my chest. "He fell, hit his head," George said, his tone final. "End of story." The lie hung between us, heavy and obvious, but he offered nothing more. "Will you be back tonight?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I thought of the shadows, the scream, the footsteps on the roof, of Thomas's hidden bottles and cryptic notes, of the metal door in the basement with its 3 locks. "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll be back." He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving me alone with the weight of the night and the questions that refused to be silenced. Unearthing the past, the library's whispered truths. Back at the cabin, the forest looked like a forest again. Just trees and bushes, nothing sinister in the morning light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, that the shadows of the night had left their mark. I needed answers, and the library seemed like the best place to start. The building was a relic, its heavy oak doors groaning on their hinges as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, the shelves sagging under the weight of books that hadn't been touched in years. A gray-haired woman sat behind the front desk, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she stamped books with a rhythm that spoke of routine, of a life lived in the shadow of this town's secrets. "Help you?" she asked without looking up, her voice sharp, efficient. "I'm researching local history," I said, my voice steady despite the unease that clung to me, specifically around Raven's Peak Lodge. Her hand froze mid-stamp, the book hovering in the air as her eyes snapped up to meet mine, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze piercing, as if she could see straight through me to the questions I carried. "Town records are in the back room," she finally said, pointing to a door with flaking green paint. "Newspapers are on microfilm, history sections on the left wall." Her tone was clipped, a warning wrapped in the guise of assistance, and I nodded, thanking her as I headed toward the back room. The space was a mausoleum of knowledge, its metal shelving units packed tight with cardboard boxes and bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of decay. A single microfilm reader sat on a desk in the corner, its pale blue light casting an eerie glow across the room. I started with the history books, pulling down anything that mentioned Blue Ridge or the surrounding mountains, my fingers leaving trails in the dust that coated their spines. Most were standard local histories, when the town was founded, who the first settlers were, how the logging industry shaped the area, but there was nothing about strange occurrences, nothing about things in the woods. The pages were dry, factual, a carefully curated narrative that revealed nothing of the town's darker underbelly. The microfilm proved more useful, though no less frustrating. I loaded spools of local newspapers, starting with the most recent and working backward, The machines hum, a steady companion in the silent room. At first, the articles were mundane: town council meetings, school events, weather reports, the kind of small-town minutiae that filled the pages of a paper with little else to report. But then I hit 1972, and a headline stopped me cold. 3 dead in mountain incident. The article was maddeningly vague, its language careful, evasive. 3 maintenance workers at Raven's Peak Lodge were found deceased yesterday morning. Sheriff Robert Tanner cited multiple factors in the deaths and assured residents that the situation has been contained. The lodge will remain closed for 2 weeks during investigation. No names, no cause of death, no follow-up articles in the subsequent issues. Just a void, a silence that spoke louder than words. I kept scrolling backward, my eyes straining against the flickering screen, and a pattern began to emerge, slow and insidious, like a shadow creeping across the floor. Every few years, there was a brief mention of someone gone missing. A hiker who never returned to his campsite. A hunter who ventured too deep into the woods. A teenager who took a dare to spend the night on the mountain. Some were found, their bodies broken and bloodless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Many were not, their disappearances swallowed by the forest, their names fading into whispers. The articles were always short, their details sparse, as if the town were afraid to speak too loudly, to draw the attention of whatever lurked in the shadows. The librarian appeared behind me, her sudden presence making me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. "We're closing in 5 minutes," she said, her eyes flicking to the screen, her expression unreadable. "Find what you needed?" "Not exactly," I admitted, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "These articles about the disappearances, they're pretty light on details." She took off her glasses, cleaning them with the bottom of her cardigan, her movements slow, deliberate. "Small town papers report what the town needs to know," she said, her tone flat, a warning. "And what about what really happened?" I pressed, my frustration bubbling over. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp as a blade. "You're Thomas Mitchell's nephew," she said. Not a question but a statement, her voice heavy with recognition. "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "I'm working at the lodge now." "Then you should be careful what you go looking for," she said, her voice low, urgent. "Some questions are better left unasked in Blue Ridge." She reached past me and switched off the microfilm reader, the screen going dark with a faint hum, and I gathered my notes, my mind racing as I headed out into the fading light. The bar's reluctant truths, whispers of the old ways. The sun was setting as I left the library, the mountains casting dark purple shadows across the town, their presence a constant reminder of the secrets they held. My shift at the lodge didn't start for another 4 hours, and I needed something to steady my nerves. Not alcohol, I reminded myself, my sobriety a fragile shield against the darkness that threatened to overwhelm me. The Timberline line was the only bar in town, its neon beer signs glowing in the windows, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Inside, the place was half full, mostly men in work clothes drinking beers at small tables, their voices low, their laughter forced. Conversation stopped as I walked in, a dozen pairs of eyes turning to stare, then started again, quieter now, a murmur of suspicion that followed me to the bar. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a club soda with lime, the bartender raising an eyebrow but saying nothing as he slid the glass across to me. "You're Mitchell's nephew," a voice said to my left, rough and weathered, like the bark of an ancient tree. I turned to find a man in his 50s, his skin rough from years of labor, his hands work-worn and scarred, a beer glass in front of him with 3 empties pushed to the side. His eyes were sharp, despite the alcohol, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Words fast," I said, my voice steady despite the unease that coiled in my gut. "Small town," he replied, extending a hand. "David Wilson. I worked with your uncle a few times, logging jobs." I shook his hand, his grip firm, unyielding. "Ryan Mitchell," I said. "Heard you took his job at the lodge." I nodded, sipping my soda, the lime's tang sharp against my tongue. 3 nights in. His eyes sharpened, a glint of something, curiosity, perhaps, or fear, flashing in their depths. And, he asked, his voice low, seen anything yet? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. I thought of the screams in the night, the footsteps on the roof, the shadows at the tree line, their movements too purposeful, too predatory to be mere tricks of the light. Maybe, I said carefully, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. David nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew, and glanced around the bar, his movements quick, furtive, as if checking for eavesdroppers. He slid onto the stool next to mine, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your uncle and I talked sometimes when he'd come in here, he said, his breath heavy with the scent of beer. He asked questions too, about the mountain, about the things people see up there. What kind of things? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. David took a long pull from his beer, his eyes distant, as if he were looking into a past he'd rather forget. Been here all my life, he said, his voice low, urgent. My daddy too, and his daddy before him. Some things you just grow up knowing, like staying on the paths, like not going into certain parts of the woods after dark, like what happens to folks who break the rules. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your uncle knew what was out there. We all do. Been here for generations. Some call it a beast. Others say it's something older than the mountains themselves. The words sent a chill down my spine, a confirmation of the fears that had been growing in my mind since that first night at the cabin. I don't call it anything, David continued, his voice barely audible now. Don't talk about it at all most times. Bad luck. Then why are you talking to me? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. He drained his beer and signaled for another, his fingers trembling slightly as he set the empty glass down. Because you're here now, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Because you took that job. And because your uncle was asking the same questions before he died. What happened to him? I asked, my voice low, urgent. Really? David accepted a fresh beer from the bartender, waiting until the man moved away before speaking again. Official story as he fell, hit his head, he said, his voice flat, unconvincing. And the unofficial story? Pressed. He went looking for answers, David said, his fingers tapping nervously on his glass. Found something else instead. He glanced toward the door, his posture tense, as if he were considering making a run for it. Look, I shouldn't be saying this much, he said, his voice trembling. Town has ways of dealing with people who talk too much. Who should I talk to then? I asked, my frustration bubbling over. Someone must know what's really going on. David hesitated, his eyes darting to the door again, then sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Ask the old man who lives by Blackwater Creek, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold knows more than anyone. Cabins about 3 miles up the north road, where the creek bends under the big oak. Harold who? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Jenkins, David said. Harold Jenkins. He stood abruptly, tossing some bills on the bar, his movements quick, jerky. I've said too much already, he muttered, hunching his shoulders as if expecting a blow. Just be careful up there at night. Stay on the paths. Don't go investigating strange noises. He headed for the door, his steps hurried, and I watched him go, the weight of his words settling into my bones like a cold fog. The shadow across the road, a glimpse of the unseen. Outside, the night had deepened, the town shrouded in darkness, the half-moon casting a faint, silvery light across the empty street. The air was cold, biting, and as I walked to my car, parked at the end of the block, I felt a sudden chill that had little to do with the temperature. The hair on my arms stood on end, a primal instinct screaming that something was wrong, that I was being watched. I stopped, my breath fogging in the air, and listened. The town was dead quiet. No cars, no footsteps, just the faint hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance and the rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I saw it. A massive shadow darted across the road ahead, moving with a speed that defied its size, its form hulking and four-legged, unlike any animal I'd ever seen. My heart leaped into my throat, my hand fumbling for the flashlight in my pocket. I clicked it on, the beam trembling as I swept it across the road, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement in the bushes on either side, just the empty street stretching out before me. But the air smelled different now, a mix of wet fur and pennies, a scent that spoke of something primal, something predatory. I stood frozen, my hand shaking as I held the flashlight, my mind racing with possibilities. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't just passing through. It was watching, waiting, and I had the sinking feeling that it had been watching me since I arrived in Blue Ridge. I rushed to my car, my footsteps loud on the pavement, and locked the doors as soon as I was inside, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, my headlights cutting through the darkness, but as I drove toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the shadow I'd seen was still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my lights, its eyes fixed on me with a hunger I could feel in my bones. Harold Jenkins' warning, the keeper of the pact. Following David's directions, I drove to Blackwater Creek, the road turning from pavement to gravel as the trees closed in around me, their branches scraping against the windows of my car like skeletal fingers. The forest here was denser, darker, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. David had said to look for the big oak where the creek bent, but in these woods, every tree looked ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. The road narrowed further, forcing me to slow to a crawl, my headlights illuminating a wooden bridge crossing the creek, its planks gray and worn, creaking ominously under the weight of my car. Past the bridge, a small cabin came into view, its metal roof glinting faintly in the fading light, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. I parked and turned off the engine, the silence rushing in to fill the void, broken only by the soft gurgle of the creek and the distant tap of a woodpecker. The cabin looked barely lived in, its walls weathered and sagging, a stack of split wood leaning against one side, the porch drooping in the middle as if bowing under the weight of years. On that porch sat a man in a wooden rocking chair, so still I hadn't noticed him at first, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I got out of the car and approached the bridge, the old boards creaking under my weight, each step a test of my resolve. "You're Thomas's boy?" the man called before I'd even reached the other side, his voice carrying clearly across the space between us, neither raised nor strained, yet heavy with certainty. I stopped halfway across, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm his nephew," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Ryan Mitchell." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Harold Jenkins," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Come sit." I crossed the rest of the bridge and climbed the 3 steps to the porch, the wood groaning under my weight. Up close, Harold looked older than I'd expected. His face a map of deep wrinkles, his hair pure white, but his eyes were bright, piercing, as if they could see straight through me to the fears I carried. "How did you know who I was?" I asked, lowering myself into the chair, the wood creaking beneath me. "You look like him around the eyes," Harold said, his voice low, steady, as he resumed rocking, the chair making a soft rhythm against the wooden boards. "And not many strangers come this way." I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, the leather pouch he'd given me a reassuring weight in my pocket. "David Wilson told me I should talk to you," I said, my voice steady despite the unease that coiled in my gut. Harold's mouth twitched, a flicker of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "David talks too much when he drinks," he said, his tone dry, a hint of reproach in his words. "Always has." He said, "You know things about the mountain." "I know many things," Harold replied, his rocking slowing but not stopping. "Which ones are you after?" I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, my voice low, urgent. "I've been working at the lodge for 3 nights now," I said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I've heard screams in the forest, footsteps on the roof, seen shadows moving between the trees." Harold's rocking slowed further, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, his expression unreadable. "You've been hearing it at night, haven't you?" he said, his tone making my stomach drop. He already knew, had expected it even, and the realization sent a chill down my spine. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling now, the fear I'd been holding at bay rushing to the surface. Harold looked past me to the darkening forest, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The mountain has always had a keeper, he said, his voice low, heavy with the weight of years. Something old, something that was here long before the first settlers cut down trees to build their homes. A beast, some call it. Names don't matter much to things that old. The words settled into me like a cold fog, a confirmation of the fears that had been growing in my mind since that first night at the cabin. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Same as any living thing, Harold said, his eyes coming back to mine, their brightness a stark contrast to the shadows that surrounded us. Territory. Food. He paused, his rocking stopping completely, the silence that followed heavy with implication. The town made a pact generations ago, he continued, his voice steady, unyielding. We stay on marked paths, never hunt in certain areas, leave offerings at stone markers deep in the woods. Food mostly, sometimes tools or clothes, things it finds useful. And in return, it takes only what it needs. The implications of his words hung in the air between us, a dark promise that spoke of sacrifice, of a balance maintained through fear and blood. I thought of the missing hikers, the dead maintenance workers, the strange silence in the forest at night, and a cold dread settled into my bones. My uncle, I said, my voice trembling now, the question burning in my chest. What happened to him? Harold's rocking stopped completely, his face grim, his eyes darkening with a sorrow that seemed to span centuries. Thomas broke the rules, he said, his voice low, heavy with regret. Got curious about what was behind that metal door. My breath caught in my throat, the memory of the basement door with its 3 locks flashing through my mind. What's behind it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. A way in, Harold said, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of fear flashing in their depths. Or maybe a way out for it. The sun was nearly gone now, the clearing growing dark, the shadows lengthening as the forest seemed to close in around us. Harold looked up at the darkening sky and stood abruptly, his movements quick, urgent. You need to go, he said, his voice sharp, a command. It's not safe after dark. I stood too, my mind racing, the questions piling up like storm clouds. But I still don't understand, I said, my voice desperate now, the need for answers a physical ache in my chest. Understanding won't save you, Harold snapped, disappearing into the cabin for a moment before returning with a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers cold against mine, the pouch heavy for its size. Keep this with you, he said, his voice low, urgent. Stay on the path. Never leave the lodge during your shift. I took the pouch, its weight a reassurance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling. Protection of a sort, Harold said, already ushering me toward the steps, his movements quick, jerky. Go now, and don't come back here after sunset. I stumbled down the steps, the urgency in his voice pushing me forward, my mind racing with questions I didn't have time to ask. At the bridge, I turned back, the words spilling out in a rush. My uncle's journal mentioned footprints, scratching, things getting closer. I said, my voice desperate. What was he talking about? Harold stood at the edge of his porch, half in shadow now, his face deadly serious. The beast tests boundaries, he said, his voice low, heavy with warning. Always has, but something's changed. It's getting bolder. Why? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Because the pact is weakening, Harold said, his voice a whisper now, barely audible over the gurgle of the creek. Has been for years. Your uncle wasn't the first to break the rules, just the most recent. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, the forest darkening rapidly around us. Go, Harold said one last time, his voice a command, a plea. And remember, stay on the paths. I drove back too fast on the narrow road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror more than the path ahead, the trees seeming to crowd the road behind me, their branches reaching out like claws. By the time I reached regular pavement, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and closed the curtains, the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. I still had 3 hours before my shift at the lodge, and I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I opened the leather pouch Harold had given me. Inside was a small bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, their scent strong and acrid, a mix of sage and something I couldn't identify. Beneath the herbs was a tooth, yellow and curved, as long as my thumb, its jagged edge gleaming in the light, too large for any normal animal. Whatever it had come from would have had a mouthful of these, something that ate meat, something that hunted. My phone rang, making me jump, the sound sharp in the silence of the cabin. Emma's name flashed on the screen, and I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "Ryan, you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "You sound weird." "I'm fine," I lied, my eyes fixed on the tooth on the table, its jagged edge a silent threat. "Just getting ready for work. How's it going? The job working out?" she asked, her tone gentle, probing. I glanced at the tooth again, the weight of the night's revelations pressing against me. "It's interesting," I said, the word inadequate, a pale reflection of the terror that coiled in my gut. "Interesting how?" she pressed, her voice sharpening with concern. "Just different than I expected," I said, unable to tell her the truth. Not about the screams, the shadows, the beast that Harold had spoken of. She'd think I was hallucinating, that sobriety had cracked something in my brain, and I couldn't bear the thought of her worry, her doubt. "How are things with you?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. "Same old," she said, her tone softening. "Listen, I was thinking of coming to visit next month. See this place you're settling into." "No," I said too quickly, my voice sharp, panicked. "I mean, not yet. Let me get more established first." Silence stretched on the line, heavy with her unspoken concern. "Ryan, are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "You don't sound like yourself." "Just tired," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Night shifts are messing with my sleep." "If you say so," she said, her tone unconvinced. "Call me if you need anything. Okay? Anytime." "I will," I said, my voice steady despite the lie. "Promise." "Promise?" she echoed, and we hung up, the silence rushing back to fill the void. I slipped the tooth and herbs back into the pouch, its weight a reassurance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me, and ate a quick dinner, the food tasteless on my tongue. Then I headed to the lodge for my shift, the darkness outside pressing against the windows of my car, the forest watching, waiting, as I drove into the night. The lodge's second night. The beast draws closer. George was waiting in the security office when I arrived, flipping through the previous night's log with a scowl that deepened as he read. He looked up as I entered, his pale eyes narrowing slightly. "You're early," he said, checking his watch, his tone a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Couldn't sleep?" I replied, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on me. His eyes narrowed further, a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, or suspicion, flashing in their depths. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I thought about telling him I'd spoken with Harold, about the beast, the pact, the door in the basement, but something in his earlier warning made me hesitate. "Just getting used to the schedule," I said, the lie coming easily, a shield against his scrutiny. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and turned back to the logbook. "Make your rounds on time tonight," he said, his tone clipped, efficient. "We had some disturbances last night after you left." "What kind of disturbances?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Nothing to worry about," he said, his tone dismissive. "Just keep to the paths and log anything unusual." He headed for the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. "And Mitchell," he said, his voice low, a warning. "Whatever you hear tonight, stay inside." The door closed behind him before I could ask what he meant, leaving me alone in the flickering light of the monitors, my hand instinctively reaching for the leather pouch in my pocket, its weight a reassurance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. At 10 o'clock, I made my first round, the lodge quiet, the empty guest rooms locked and dark, their silence oppressive. In the basement, I checked the metal door with its 3 locks, all secure, the scratched surface gleaming in the dim light. By midnight, the usual silence had fallen outside. No crickets, no night birds, no rustling leaves, just a dead air that pressed against my ears, a void that seemed to swallow sound itself. At 12:17 a.m., it started. A low howl from somewhere in the forest, rising in pitch until it seemed to fill the entire night. A sound too deep, too sustained to be a wolf. It held for nearly 30 seconds before fading, leaving a ringing in my ears, a reminder of its power. I checked the monitors, my hands trembling, but nothing moved on any screen. The howling came again at 1:05, closer this time, its source just beyond the tree line, a presence I could feel in my bones. I made my rounds at 1:30, staying inside as George had warned, my flashlight sweeping through the windows, the darkness outside a solid wall I couldn't penetrate. At 2:22 a.m., during my rounds, I heard scratching at the main entrance. 3 distinct scratches, a pause, then 3 more, the same pattern I'd heard at the cabin my first night. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight raised, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft thump, like something heavy leaning against the wood. I froze, my hand tightening around the leather pouch in my pocket, its weight a reassurance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. After a full minute of silence, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole, my breath fogging the glass. There was nothing but darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch into eternity. I returned to the security office and logged what I'd heard, my handwriting shaky, the pen digging into the paper as if I could force the truth onto the page. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. No more howls, no more scratching, just the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting, its patience a threat in itself. When George arrived at 7:55, I was already packed up to leave, my nerves frayed, my body aching from the tension of the night. "Anything to report?" he asked, scanning the logbook, his face impassive. "Howling closer than before," I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on me. "Scratching at the main entrance around 2:30. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk, a flicker of tension breaking through his stoic facade. "Did you go outside?" he asked, his voice sharp, urgent. "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "You said to stay in." He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Good," he said, his voice low, a relief I didn't understand. "That's good." I hesitated, then decided to take the risk, the questions burning in my chest too urgent to ignore. "I talked to Harold Jenkins yesterday," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. George's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly alert, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or anger, flashing in their depths. "What did he tell you?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, but I could hear the tension beneath it, the strain of a man holding back a storm. "About the pact," I said, my voice low, urgent. "The beast, what's behind the door." "And you believe him?" George asked, his tone still neutral, but his eyes betrayed him, their pale blue depths glittering with something I couldn't name. "I believe something's out there," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Something that killed my uncle." George was silent for a long moment, studying my face, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of my words had settled into him like a stone. "Harold knows things, yes," he said, his voice low, heavy with resignation. "But he's not always reliable. He seemed pretty clear to me, I countered, my frustration bubbling over. Just be careful what you take as truth around here, George said, picking up the logbook, his movements slow, deliberate. Some stories get twisted over time. I nodded, not convinced, but unwilling to push further, the weight of the night pressing against me like a physical force. See you tonight, I said, my voice hollow, and he nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion before turning to leave. The rabbit and the journal, signs of the unseen. The morning air felt clean after the stale air of the lodge, the forest looking like a forest again. Just trees and bushes, nothing sinister in the daylight. But as I pulled up to the cabin, I spotted something on the front porch, a small, dark shape that sent a chill down my spine. I got out to check, my footsteps slow, cautious, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a dead rabbit, its neck broken cleanly, its body untouched by scavengers, its eyes glassy and unseeing. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a clean, deliberate break, as if it had been placed there for me to find. A message, a warning, or perhaps an offering. I looked around, the clearing empty, the forest quiet except for the normal morning sounds. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I picked up the rabbit by its back legs, its body limp in my hands, and carried it to the edge of the woods, tossing it into the bushes with a shudder. The act felt ritualistic, as if I were participating in something I didn't fully understand. And as I turned back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest itself was aware of my every move. Inside, I flipped through Thomas's journal, its cover old and smooth from use, its pages yellowed at the edges. I'd found it hidden behind some old incident reports in the security office filing cabinet, not where it should have been with his other belongings. Someone had placed it there on purpose, a secret meant to be uncovered. The first entries were mundane, a record of a man doing his job, weather notes, maintenance issues, quick mentions of wildlife he saw during his night rounds. March 3rd, quiet night, fixed loose railing on east staircase. Raccoon got into the dumpster again. March 7th, heavy rain, leaking lobby ceiling near fireplace. Left note for maintenance. But around mid-April, the tone shifted, the writing growing more frantic, more desperate, as if Thomas had sensed the darkness closing in around him. April 16th, heard something in the basement tonight, he wrote, his handwriting shaky, the pen digging into the paper. Not pipes, not settling, like whispers. Checked 3 times. Nothing there. I turned the page, my heart pounding in my chest, the words a mirror to my own experiences, a confirmation of the fears that had been growing in my mind. April 22nd, footprints outside the east entrance, he continued, his handwriting growing messier, the lines slanting across the page. Too big for a person. Not shaped right for a bear. George says I'm seeing things. The next entry sent a chill down my spine. May 3rd, they're watching me from the trees. I can see their eyes reflecting my flashlight. Not animals. They don't move right. I turned the page, my coffee growing cold beside me, forgotten in the face of Thomas's growing terror. May 10th, found scratches on the basement door. 3 sets. Always 3. George says it's nothing. He's lying. May 17th, it knows when I'm alone. It waits until I'm alone. The final pages were a descent into madness. The handwriting so messy it was barely legible. Some sentences stopping halfway. Others pressed so hard into the paper they nearly broke through. May 30th, can't sleep. The scratching at my windows at home now. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. June 2nd, Harold knows. He's always known. Says I need to stay on the paths. Too late for that. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, sent a shiver down my spine. June 5th, it's not what they say it is. Not a beast. Something worse. It wears faces. It knows things. I closed the journal, my hands shaking, the security office feeling smaller now, the monitors showing empty hallways and the quiet forest beyond. A facade of normalcy that hid the truth I was beginning to uncover. The child's cry, a lure into the dark. My watch showed 1:47 a.m. Time for another round. the lodge creaking around me as I grabbed my flashlight and radio, slipping the journal into my jacket pocket. The main floor was quiet, the usual noises of an old building, creaks and groans, the settling of wood and stone, but nothing out of the ordinary. The basement was last, as always, its concrete floors echoing with my steps, the air growing colder with each descent. I hated going down there, especially after reading Thomas's journal, the memory of his words. Whispers in the basement, scratches on the door, echoing in my mind like a warning. I was halfway down the hallway when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the utility entrance to the metal door, their shape unnatural, too large, with claw marks at the edges, not human, not bear, nothing I could identify. I followed slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam catching the scratches on the door. 3 parallel lines, deep enough to cut the steel, fresh and raw, a testament to the force that had made them. I touched them, the rough edges cold against my fingers, a shiver running down my spine. Something had tried to get in or out. My radio crackled, making me jump, George's voice tight with tension. "Mitchell, you there?" he asked, his tone urgent. I keyed the mic, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. "Yeah, in the basement." A pause, then, "Stay there." I waited, the hum of the heating system and my own breathing the only sounds in the cold corridor. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard the security door upstairs slam open, footsteps pounding down the stairs. George appeared at the end of the hallway, still buttoning his flannel shirt, his hair sticking up on one side, his face a mask of anger and fear. "What did you see?" he demanded, striding toward me, his movements quick, jerky. I pointed at the footprints, their muddy trail stark against the concrete. "These weren't here during my midnight round," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. George stared at the tracks, then at the scratched door, his face going slack for a moment before hardening into something between anger and terror. "You need to forget what you saw," he said, pushing past me to a supply closet, pulling out a mop and bucket with a clatter. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising, incredulous. "Cleaning up," he snapped, filling the bucket at a utility sink, water sloshing onto his shoes in his haste. "Shouldn't we document this?" I asked, my frustration bubbling over. "Call someone?" "No," he said, the word sharp as a slap. He began mopping the mud, erasing the prints with quick, aggressive strokes, his movements jerky, panicked. "This isn't something we report." I pulled the journal from my pocket, its weight a reassurance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "My uncle saw things too," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Wrote about them." George's hands froze on the mop handle, his face draining of color so quickly I thought he might pass out. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low, trembling. "Found it in the filing cabinet," I said, holding it up, the leather cover worn and smooth. "Someone hid it." "Give it to me," he said, holding out his hand, water dripping from his fingers onto the concrete floor, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. I stepped back, keeping the journal out of reach. "It's my uncle's," I said, my voice steady, unyielding. "Belongs to me now." George's jaw worked, a muscle twitching in his cheek, his eyes glittering with something I couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or rage. "Your uncle couldn't let it go," he said, his voice low, heavy with warning. "And look what happened." "What did happen?" I asked, my voice rising, the question burning in my chest. "Because I'm starting to think he didn't just fall." George resumed mopping, his movements jerky, aggressive. "Some things are better left alone, Mitchell," he said, his voice low, a warning. "This town has ways of dealing with problems. Has for generations. Harold Jenkins told me about the pact," I said, the words spilling out in a rush, my frustration bubbling over. The mop clattered to the floor, George's face draining of color so quickly I thought he might collapse. "Stay away from him," he whispered, his voice trembling, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the sink. "He's not right in the head. He seemed pretty clear to me." I countered, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. Told me about the beast, the offerings, the boundaries. George picked up the mop, his hands trembling now, his movements slow, deliberate. Harold Jenkins is dangerous, he said, his voice low, heavy with warning. He knows things, yes, but he's not what you think. What is he, then? I asked, my voice rising, the questions piling up like storm clouds. Just stay away from him, George said, finishing the cleaning with more force than necessary. The mop's handle creaking under his grip. And stay on the paths, always on the paths. He gathered his cleaning supplies and headed for the stairs, then paused, looking back at me, his eyes filled with something like pity. You're a lot like your uncle, he said, his voice low, heavy with resignation. Curious, stubborn. He couldn't stop digging either. Is that why he died? I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. George's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something like regret there, a flicker of emotion that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Finish your shift, Mitchell, he said, his voice flat, unyielding. Lock up when you leave, and for God's sake, stay inside. After he left, I stood alone in the basement corridor, staring at the now clean floor and the scratched door, the journal heavy in my pocket, its words echoing in my mind like a warning. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, the lodge creaking around me, the monitors showing nothing but empty hallways and the quiet forest beyond. At 4:17 a.m., I heard it, a child crying outside, the sound faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, a soft, hiccuping sob that might have been the wind. But it came again, clearer this time, unmistakable, a sound of distress that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I checked the monitors, my hands trembling, the exterior camera showing nothing but empty grounds and dark trees. But the crying continued, rising and falling, a desperate plea that tugged at my heart. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, hesitating at the door, George's warning echoing in my mind. Stay inside. But it was a child, a lost, frightened child, and I couldn't ignore that, couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. I keyed my radio, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. George, you there? I asked, the static crackling in response. I tried again, but there was nothing, just the hiss of an empty line. The crying grew louder, more desperate, each sob a knife to the heart. I made my decision, unlocking the main entrance and stepping outside, the night air hitting me like a wall, cold and damp, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the empty parking lot to the tree line beyond, where a small figure stood, child-sized, perfectly still, its back to me. Hello? I called, my voice sounding thin in the vast silence, the words swallowed by the night. Are you okay? The crying stopped, the figure motionless, its silence a weight I could feel in my bones. I took a step forward, then another, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It's all right, I said, my voice steady despite the fear that coiled in my gut. I'm here to help. The figure backed away, disappearing between the trees, its movements quick, jerky, a lure I couldn't resist. Wait, I called, moving faster, following the small shape as it withdrew deeper into the forest, my flashlight catching glimpses. A pale arm, the back of a head, small feet moving between fallen logs. I pushed through branches, stumbling over roots, the lodge lights growing farther away behind me, the child staying just ahead, always visible but never quite reachable. Please stop, I called, my voice desperate now, the need to help a physical ache in my chest. I won't hurt you. The figure stopped in a small clearing, its back to me, and I felt a surge of relief as I approached, my flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. Hey, there, I said, my voice soft, gentle. Are you lost? Let me help you get. I stopped mid-sentence, my breath catching in my throat as my flashlight beam revealed the ground beneath my feet. No path, just wild forest floor, untouched by human traffic. I'd left the path, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Harold's warning echoing in my mind. Stay on the paths. The crying stopped, the clearing falling silent, the air thick with a tension that made my ears feel stuffed. Not even insects daring to break the stillness. Slowly, the small figure turned, and my flashlight caught its face for just a moment. Blank, expressionless, with eyes that reflected the light back at me. A mirror of my own fear. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, not from the child but from everywhere at once. The trees, the ground, the air itself. A sound that shook my chest and made my teeth rattle. I backed away, my flashlight jumping wildly across the trees, shadows moving between the trunks, huge, liquid shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk, their forms indistinct but menacing, a threat I could feel in my bones. More growls joined the first, a circle of sound that closed in around me, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the forest itself were conspiring against me. The child figure stood completely still now, its blank face a mask of indifference, its reflective eyes unblinking, watching as I turned and ran, smashing through bushes, branches slapping my face, their sting a sharp contrast to the terror that drove me. Behind me, the growling grew louder, closer, the snap of branches breaking under heavy weight a constant reminder of the pursuit, of the thing that hunted me. Something brushed my back. Not quite touching, but close enough to feel its heat, its presence a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't look,